The enemy we have to face down is inflation.
You can't overstate how much a short-term mindset dominates Westminster.
The cost of living crisis is not going away. It's very real for people.
We've got to focus very much on the things that will really bring back growth.
The UK has certainly been a very strong supporter of Ukraine from the outset.
We have to stay the course to make sure inflation falls all the way back to the 2% target.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker.
Now, before we talk about some really big news on Rishi Sunak's green policy rollback, we've got a little bit of economic news to discuss. Britain's inflation rate has unexpectedly dropped to the lowest level in 18 months. Consumer prices in the year to August came in at 6.7%. Economists, not the first time they've been wrong, were expecting the reading to tick up to 7%.
Yeah, I mean, there was also some good news on the core measure of inflation. So this is the one that excludes all the volatility in food prices and energy prices. And it's really the one that the Bank of England focuses on. That fell pretty sharply from 6.9% to 6.2%. Pretty timely, of course, because we've got the Bank of England interest rate decision on Thursday, widely expected to be another rate hike. Ouch, I can hear you saying. I know. Our UK correspondent Lizzy Burden, though, is here to chat over the numbers. Now, this was a really big surprise on inflation. What's gone right?
Yeah, pleasant surprise for once. One bit that you didn't mention is services inflation. That also surprised by easing from 7.4% to 6.8%. So it's the headline level core inflation and services inflation that have all been pleasantly surprising, both for the Bank of England and for the UK Treasury. You say about the interest rate decision tomorrow, we've actually seen traders changing their pricing, their bets on what's going to happen throughout the morning. And now it's a 50-50 chance whether it's going to be a hike tomorrow by 25 basis points or a hold, whether we're already there. And in fact, Goldman Sachs' economists have actually just changed their call. They say that we're already at the peak of Table Mountain, as the chief economist of the Bank of England, Hugh Pill, has put it. Look, the encouraging thing here is services inflation easing, because it suggests that we might not have as big a wage price spiral as previously thought. So when you say what's driving all of this, the bad thing is fuel. That was the biggest contribution upwards. The good news is maybe people are not asking for as big raises as they were before.
Now, Lizzie, obviously this is top of Rishi Sunak's policy priority list. He's got 3 months just over to get it down to 5% by the end of the year. How is it looking for that target?
Well, according to the OECD, not too great. So it revised its forecast yesterday. It now sees inflation potentially ending the year at 7.2%. And remember, if Rishi Sunak wants to halve inflation by the end of the year, it'd have to be just over 5%. So, in other words, the OECD doesn't think he's going to hit his number one target. What's even more bruising about that is that the chief economist of the OECD is Claire Lombardelli, who, of course, used to be, in her last job, chief economic advisor to the UK Treasury. So here's a woman who knows the UK economy inside out.
Yeah, absolutely. OK, that's really interesting on inflation, Lizzie. Thank you so much for explaining. Look, one does wonder, though, with economic growth in the UK still bouncing along the flat line, actually on a monthly basis, of the last monthly data we had, there was a contraction in UK GDP. Do we end up with a moment of stagflation, that could perhaps be an even bigger worry than just the very high inflation rate that the UK has seen?
Yeah, that dreaded word. I think the growth numbers are bumping along, aren't they? There's been a bit of up and a bit of down. There's not really a clear picture on that, except we are pretty stagnant, I think it's fair to say. That does go for a lot of the rest of Europe as well, though. So yeah, it's a pretty ropey economic picture at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. OK, so that was the good news for the Prime Minister. But Rishi Sunak has had a very difficult time of it today with the idea that he will roll back some green energy policies. The Prime Minister says without abandoning the UK's overall carbon goals. So this started with the reports that the Prime Minister was going to soften key green policies in a major speech expected later this week ahead of the party conference. The idea being to extend the deadline for the ban on fossil fuel cars by perhaps 5 years and weaken the plans to phase out gas boilers. this has caused such a backlash, it would seem, that the Prime Minister is expected to give more details more swiftly than we had expected. He's going to be briefing the media this Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, interesting that he's had to bring this forward. It was a big leak, wasn't it, on the BBC? A huge raft of policies being rolled back. He won't be happy with that. You have to wonder that it came from a high-level source. But the whole idea of a major U-turn on climate policies is really opening up quite a rift in the party. It's also brought criticism from some business leaders as well. Well, among the plans reportedly being considered, extending the deadline for the ban on fossil fuel car sales by 5 years from 2030 to 2035 and weakening plans to phase out gas boilers. But the whole idea of a major U-turn on climate policies has opened up a major rift in Sunak's party and brought criticism from some business leaders. Well, joining us now to discuss this is Adam Bell, Director of Policy at Stonehaven, was the Head of Energy Strategy at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy right up until last year. Adam, thanks for joining us on the show today. What do you think of what's been reported to be happening from the government today?
So it feels very much like a short-termist announcement. I think there's a reasonable case to be made that we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis and that government needs to act to compensate for that. But pushing back bans that wouldn't come into effect in any case until the end of the decade at least won't have any impact upon customers right now, won't have any impact upon the amount they have to pay. But what it will do is it will send a signal to an awful lot of international investors that the UK is unserious about some of its net zero commitments and that they can't be banked upon. And you've seen a lot of pushback from people who have already spent money in the UK on the assumption that we were indeed serious.
But the issue is perhaps also that the government isn't explaining the policies to people clearly enough. They obviously see it as potentially an electoral issue that could win them votes, as it did for one parliamentary seat on the outskirts of London. Is it that the government has sort of lost the favour of the public on this issue?
So our polling indicates that the public are overwhelmingly in favour of action on net zero. I think the key kind of crisis point and the reason why the Uxbridge by-election turned out the way it did is because the London ultra low emission zone was going to impose a direct cost on people today, and that is something that people couldn't countenance. Now, I think what the government is trying to do is capture some of that magic to a degree by finding new things they can push back on to demonstrate that they are in favour of the consumer. But it's not really something that will materially impact the consumer. It's much more about the presentation of it. They want the consumer to feel as though they're on their side by making these moves, whereas in reality, it'll make little difference to their lives.
Adam, does the polling change when people have a cost attached? Because replacing your car is expensive and replacing your gas boiler with a heat pump is potentially very expensive, isn't it?
So cost impacts upon how people see net zero, but not overwhelmingly so. I think it's also important to remember when these measures were going to come into place too. So a ban on internal combustion engines in cars, so a ban basically on petrol and diesel cars in 2030 is still quite a long way off. That's 7 years of more cost reduction in EVs. We've seen costs come down dramatically over the last decade. And it's another 10 years at least for cost reductions for heat pumps, which have come down over the last 5 years from about 10 grand to the model that Octopus put out the other day, which comes in at between 3 to 5 grand, depending on the size of your house. So it feels premature right now to say that these would represent cost to consumers. Technology will improve, as it has, and as we know it will do again in the future.
Okay, in terms of the possibilities, though, what you actually boil it down to a significant legal issue, because the UK's goal actually of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 is a legally binding one. So even if the government is to go ahead with doing this, can it?
So the way in which the UK's climate framework works is that the government has to meet legally set carbon budgets, which are 5-year periods with a fixed amount of carbon the UK can emit. It has to have a plan, and that plan is the legally important part. It's the plan that has been tested by NGOs in court before. Now, if the government changes its plan for meeting carbon budgets 5 and 6, and if it takes measures that will increase the amount of emissions the UK will produce, then it has to compensate for them to remain within the law. And the government's only real options in this space, and where I expect them to go, is to increase spending on capturing carbon from the atmosphere with plants, burning those plants in an electricity generator and putting that carbon underground. Thus removing carbon from the atmosphere entirely. That is, of course, very expensive. I think the interesting question now is what the government's going to have to do to justify this ostensibly consumer-facing move more expensive than the ban itself.
Adam, I want to ask you more widely about the education policy, government publication education campaigns on climate change. Do you think the government has failed on this? On some things like healthy eating, we do lots of campaigns, but even last year with the energy crisis, when bills shot up, the government rather belatedly put out a public information campaign. Do we need to do more on that?
So I think what we do need to do is give people a kind of a simpler understanding of the future. I think there's so much uncertainty from the public as to what decarbonisation really involves, and it does involve some radical shifts. In many cases, the world of 2040 or 2050 will look relatively similar today. We will still drive cars, we will still heat our homes, we'll just do those in slightly different ways. I think what the government does need to do is set out a clear kind of set of expectations, some stages for when things will happen, what that will mean for them, and what they can expect to see from government. It's that sort of confidence that that sort of very straightforward plan that worked very, very well during the pandemic, and we saw the public respond to that. The public do want to see a plan from government, but they don't need it to be as detailed and complex as the sorts of things that people like me read for fun. It needs to be simple and set out what's coming next and what they need to do in response.
I wonder, though, what you make of people like organisations like the Tony Blair Institute that raise the idea that, and one that, again, does this chime with the public and with the voter, that actually there's little point in imposing costs on UK consumers and citizens if actually, big picture, the largest emitters in the world like China and the US, if they don't move quickly on climate change, that cost borne in the UK will not have been worth it. Do you have any sort of sympathy for that global view, global perspective?
So I think it'd be reasonable if China and the US weren't doing anything to reduce their emissions, but they are. China has a net zero target as well. And the US, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has just spent billions and billions of dollars on decarbonising its economy. And as a consequence, has seen manufacturing skyrocket. I think what the important question for the UK is how we see our role in this kind of global challenge. Yes, we want to be front runners in some regards, in some particular industries like offshore wind, and in others we will buy tech from overseas. But we do need to have a very, very serious conversation around where we're going to specialise, and importantly, where are we going to spend our money to make sure that we can capture a part of the market.
If this gets delayed for years longer, is this going to make the costs even more difficult to face, because the amount of time is ticking down on this, isn't there? And the government really is short of cash. I'm thinking if this gets pushed into the next parliament, presumably that makes it even trickier to get there.
So it does increase the costs, but it does something else important as well. It removes any scope we have to capture any share of the nascent industries that are developing around decarbonisation. If we push off the EV transition for another decade, we'll all be buying Chinese-made EVs because it'll be too expensive to produce them in the UK. That is the trade-off. We're trading off perhaps a small additional cost now, which comes with some economic benefits, with a straightforward cost in the long run.
Do you think that Labour's policies that are being put forward, which have also had to be rolled back, or they have rolled back the amount of money earmarked for green policies, is that a bad sign?
In all honesty, their plan was to start spending £26 billion per year as soon as they got into office. Having been in government, it's remarkably hard to get that amount of money out of the door unless you know exactly what you're spending it on, which they would have had to spend some time figuring it out. I think it's reasonable to delay spending that amount of money until they know where they can most effectively spend it.
Do you think there's a problem with short-termism in the Department for Business? You were head of energy strategy there.
I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the department. So I think a lot of the time, a lot of policies are made up in response to the crisis of the day, as we're seeing. This is, in fact, a great example of it. There's a political pressure in the government, and they're finding new ways of changing policies in the hoof to try to respond to it. That is just the political cycle, unfortunately. The department itself would prefer to make some longer-term choices, and you're seeing some of that with some of the plans that are being developed for longer-term plans for energy network infrastructure, so plans for pylons, plans for undersea cables that do have a very, very long lifetime. And it would be good to apply that sort of longer-term thinking, even if it's just about the longer-term certainty around what markets are going to look like, just to give businesses more confidence to invest and greater clarity over what's going to happen and where they can best compete.
Just lastly, it does look like the Conservative Party themselves are deeply split on this issue. I mean, this must be quite a frustrating point for you, having spent years talking about these issues. We've had record temperatures again in the UK and across Europe this summer, sky-high energy prices last year. It must be very difficult to have this debate. What do you think is your one message to whoever comes into government next year in terms of delivering when it comes to climate change and energy policies for the UK?
So I think the one thing I'd want to communicate is that you do have to act in order to reduce our emissions, not just because we provide leadership on the world stage that encourages other countries to come with us, because without that sort of investment, our ability to deliver economic growth in the long term will be constrained. We will not be producing things here. We will not be manufacturing things here. We'll just be takers. We'll just be buyers, and we might not have enough cash to do so.
Adam, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg UK Politics. That's Adam Bell, Director of Policy at Stonehaven, formerly at the Department for Energy, Business and Industrial Strategy.
So then more details on the big announcement from government and how it will actually impact car manufacturers. Ford's UK chair this morning ripped into the government saying, quote, "Our business needs three things from the UK government: ambition, commitment and consistency, and relaxation of the 2030 target would undermine all three." So it seems to me a surprisingly clear and quite frustrated, perhaps even angry response from business when it comes to these climate goals and what the Conservative government's going to do.
Yeah, really punchy response from the Ford boss. Well, Lizzy Burden and Tom Mackenzie spoke to the head of the UK's car-making trade body, Mike Hawes. This is the SMMT. They first asked him what financial impact these changes would have on the car companies.
Well, unfortunately, it's a difficult question to answer because we haven't seen exactly what they're proposing, as no one has yet, but also it's probably more complicated than it may first appear.
But if they roll back this new petrol and diesel cars pledged by 5 years, what would that be? What would the impact be on that on business?
Well, first of all, it sends the wrong message to the consumer because, the industry's invested billions in these new vehicles, these new technologies. It's investing billions in manufacturing them, including here in the UK, and governments and the UK government is supporting that. Now, if you then say, actually, we're going to roll back, as you suggest, it sort of sends a bizarre message to investors about what is the strategy, and more importantly for consumers, about whether or not you should make the change. And let me say now that if you want to hit net zero, as we must, you will only do that by decarbonising road transport and doing so by about 2050. So it is it's just uncertainty.
Whatever your views are in terms of the policy response, it's pretty obvious that business likes to have certainty and likes to have policy clarity, and that is clearly not what's coming from this government. You talk about the investment in this sector and some very welcome relief for the UK auto industry that's seen this steady decline over a lot more than a decade. To what extent is that investment potentially now going to be put on hold, potentially at risk?
I don't think it's at risk because, these discussions, took place over many months or years. And also remember, despite the headline, we still think that the government is about to publish, because we were with the Transport Secretary on Monday and he said it was coming very soon, a zero-emission vehicle mandate, which compels the industry by brand to sell increasing proportion of their vehicles as pure electric. And that rises to 80% of new car sales, 70% new car vans by 2030. So there's two elements to this. As you rightly say, industry wants certainty and it needs to make sure there is consistency of message if you want to attract further investment.
So business wants certainty. A lot of the people we speak to are effectively looking through the next year and a bit of Conservative government and assuming that Labour are going to be the next government. Have you talked to Labour about their plans on this area?
Yeah, we talk to all political parties, and they all want to support the industry. They recognise the contribution we make both to the economy and to jobs and so forth, and also when you're looking at the exchequer, the contribution that motorists make to the exchequer. So it is important to have a healthy industry, and it's important to have a healthy market. And I think all political parties want that. We're faced with a global transition away from a technology we've had for 120 years into a new one. It's always going to be a bit lumpy, but that's why you need to make sure you take the driver, take the consumer with us, create the incentives, make sure the transition is as smooth as possible, make sure the infrastructure is here, and that's the responsibility of not just the industry or government, but all stakeholders.
Mike, is this ultimately politics getting in the way of industry?
I think there is an element of politics, and certainly the narrative we've seen over the last 12 hours, so references the Uxbridge by-election and so forth. I think ultimately, everyone wants to get to the same place, and that is net zero. No one's arguing with that. How you get there, in our case, how we move a market is critical, not just to the industry, but to the attainment, the ability to attain net zero. Because, as I say, we are the biggest carbon-emitting sector. We know we have to go first.
Climate used to be an area the UK could claim to be a world leader on still after Brexit. If it does get rolled back, these pledges, is Britain still a world leader?
Well, I think we've seen the importance that government attached to COP26 when it hosted it in Glasgow, and the commitments that were made there. I think invariably, it's the responsibility of all countries, societies, to achieve this. But you would expect that relatively affluent countries like the UK should be leaders, and they still can continue to be. As I said, we still believe there will be other measures to drive this change, but it's important to see exactly what the details of those measures is, so we can basically understand how we can have the ability to comply. This confused message just doesn't help.
Alok Sharma, you talk about COP, and Alok Sharma has been pretty critical of what is being touted is this potential reversal. So it does certainly seem to muddy the message in terms of communication. When it comes to what you'd like to see above and beyond kind of policy prescriptions. I guess we were also speaking to Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. He talked about kind of the weaponisation of climate change. Is that a trend that you're starting to be concerned about? Is that what we're seeing? Is this a weaponisation of climate change?
That's probably overstating it. I think there's, invariably, as you say, you're getting into politics, which isn't really for industry. What we want to see is that consistency of message and the mechanisms to move the market. No one, is saying, we shouldn't be achieving net zero because it'd be, frankly, bonkers to do so. But, how you go about it, it is about moving a market. It's about reassuring the customer. It's about providing the infrastructure. And as I said, this needs to pull everyone together, not divide them apart.
So that was Mike Hawes, of course, who represents the car industry, talking about the reaction and what it will mean for car manufacturers in the UK. Look, I think the idea of rolling back green policies leaves you with a few impressions. No matter which way Rishi Sunak turns, he's boxed in. He needs bold ideas for the general election. He needs to help struggling consumers, also give business clarity and cut taxes and invest. You heard the criticism from Adam Bell that tinkering with issues that are not going to affect consumers for many years to come is sort of pointless and too far off. It's not going to affect the cost of living crisis. It just gives you the impression that the Prime Minister has a huge, tall order to deliver to everybody who wants something.
Yeah, well, he can't win them all, can he? I think this is very bold. If all the details are correct, and I think we're going to find out shortly, then this is really quite something. And I think it suggests to me, perhaps I'm overstretching this, that perhaps Rishi Sunak will fight the election on a populist agenda, because this he will see as a populist agenda. Of course, it is one with many risks, not just for our climate change targets, but it's also a risk in the blue wall. A lot of voters, middle-class voters, particularly in the south of England, who are very concerned about the environment, will not be at all impressed by this. So it will play well with some of his constituency, but it will not play well with other parts of the Tory coalition. And I think it's a gamble.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is, especially when you've got the former COP president, Alok Sharma, warning that for any party to row back on the climate agenda will not help economically or electorally. I think that's quite a swipe at the Prime Minister, and obviously the Labour Party saying it is a total farce. Yeah,
Chris Skidmore, who's the Conservative MP and a former minister, said we'll look back at this as Sunak's slow motion car crash. Zach Goldsmith, who quit as an Environment Minister, called it a moment of shame. But Craig McKinley, who's leader of the Tory Net Zero Scrutiny Group, said the announcements are sensible and pragmatic.
OK, I think this debate is going to run. No doubt we'll bring you more on it tomorrow. That's it from us, though, for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock, and our audio engineers were Rich Subnani and Maruful Hussain. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.